Erev Tov. So this Shabbos, we have Devarim. We begin the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is very different from the previous four books. In Deuteronomy, basically, you have Moses giving a series of speeches and sermons in the 40th year before he's about to die, before the Israelites are about to enter the land of Canaan. And what happens is first he goes over the history and he reviews it. And then second, he goes through the laws and he reminds them. And then once he's done all that, we have pretty much his saying goodbye, his final blessings, and then the death of Moses. So one of the things to remember is that he's reviewing the history, in some cases, things that happened 40 years before. Now, Moses is an older fellow. According to tradition, he was 120 years old. He left Egypt with the Israelites when he was 80, dies 40 years later. You can make a case, traditionalists accept that as fact. You could make the case that those numbers are symbolic, and he lived 3 40-year periods of time, 40 years simply meaning a long stretch or almost a kind of a generation. So the numbers aren't critical. But what is critical is the fact that this is 40 years later from whatever age he started. What happens to people after 40 years trying to remember what happened? And the answer is that either we forgot things, we make things up, we rewrite history, sometimes to our own benefit. Sometimes we get ideas in our head and they stay there. So here's how I want to start. In chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, verse 37, it says the following. Moses is speaking to the assembled people. Because of you, the Lord was incensed with me, and he said, you shall not enter it, the land, either. Is that really true? If you remember the story in the book of Numbers, that Moses was told, speak to the rock. He's angry. He takes his stick. He smashes the rock twice. He curses out the people. He sort of takes credit for this miracle. And at that point, God says, that's it. You're done. Right? And it's clear from the story in Numbers that it was Moses's errors, his own sins, his own mistakes that led to this decision. You can't be the one to bring the people in. And now we have, 40 years later, we have a different version of the story. Because of you, Moses says to the people, the Lord was incensed with me, and he said, you shall not enter the land. 40 years later, he's shifting blame. It's no longer what he did. It's he's suffering because of what you people did, right? So here's how I'm trying to square the circle and reconcile these two very different accounts. I'm imagining that after the Israelites hear this, a group of them, maybe 5 people, are hanging around. Israelite 1 says, he's blaming us for the fact that he can't enter the promised land. And number 2 says, that's not how I remember the story. Number 3, me neither. It was at Meribah, and we didn't have any water. God told him to speak to the rock and water would gush forth. But he lost his temper and he hit the rock twice. Number 4 says, And don't forget what he said. He called us rebels. Number 5, I remember it like it was yesterday. God said, because you didn't believe in me, he's God talking to Moses, and didn't sanctify me in the sight of the Israelites, you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. So number 1 says, so where does he get off turning this on us? Like we're to blame? And number 2 says, he is an old man. I guess he has a hard time remembering the way things happened. Number 3 says, it's not about a faulty memory. It's about not taking responsibility for his own failures. Think for a moment, what do we say about people when they get old and they make mistakes? Do we attribute it to their minds, their bodies beginning to fail? Or is this always who they were? And that's just coming out now, more so than usual. Number 4 says, he's reinventing history. The young people who weren't there will have a warped sense of what really happened. That's dangerous. Those who rewrite the past control the future. So imagine this, if the way the story really happened was the way it was written in Numbers, Moses made a series of mistakes and he was punished. But now, to a whole generation 40 years later who weren't there, who didn't know what happened, he's now saying, I'm an innocent victim here, right? And he's changing the past. So again, listen to that line. Those who rewrite the past control the future. Very critical idea. There are people who say that even today, trying to understand what's been going on in America, people who control the story, control the facts, that changes everything. Israelite number 5 says, you can't blame him for being bitter, forced to do a job he never wanted, putting up with all the grief and trouble we gave him, and in the end, not being allowed to see all his hard work rewarded. He wasn't perfect. Who is? But think about it. He's going to die alone in the wilderness without even a monument over his bones or to what he accomplished. And then Israelite number 1 says, so what do you suggest we do? Just let him blow off steam and yell at us for things he brought upon himself? And number 2 says, why not? What do you suggest? Tell him that he's senile, bitter, an old man? What's the point of that? And number 3 says, does it really matter? We're going to the land of Israel. He's not. Right? So again, we have this fascinating idea that 2 different perceptions of one event. How do we explain that? Well, traditionalists who believe the entire Torah was either dictated by God or written by Moses. Okay, it's 40 years later, maybe his memory is not so sharp. But modern scholars would say that what you really have are multiple versions of the same stories. Why would you have that? Well, because at one point you had 2 countries. The north, the 10 tribes were called Israel. The south, you had the 2 tribes, mainly the tribe of Judah in the south. And each of them had their own writers, their own recollection. And so perhaps there were 2 very different versions of what went on, of what took place. And only later, you get these two versions come down and people didn't know what to make of this. This one says this one says that. What are we going to do? And one answer is, well, pick this one and throw away that one. But they say, how could we throw away that one? Maybe that's the one that has more of the truth. And after all, we believe this is sacred literature. This is scripture, comes from God. You can't throw it away. So what happened, according to biblical scholarship, people wove together these two different stories. And unless you're paying careful attention, you may miss the fact that the details are different. Okay? So again, one story was in the book of Numbers, one story is in the book of Deuteronomy, and unless you're reading consecutively and paying attention, you may have forgotten that 2 months ago we read this, and now we're reading that. Well, what's going on here, right? So there we have the issue of different versions of the same story. How could it be? Okay, let's move on. Now we come to Deuteronomy Chapter 2. And here's what I want to share. Only 2-3 weeks ago, we read how the Israelites were, in the book of Numbers, the Israelites were traveling through the land of the Amorites, Sichon Melech HaEmori. Sichon was the king. And there was a war, and ultimately the Israelites had a tremendous victory. That's what we read about. But, and now Moses, 40, however many years later, is reminding the people of that event. Now, we read about it only a couple of weeks ago, but in actual time, it was decades later. Okay? So we read the following, page 994 in the Chumash, chapter 2, verse 30. But King Sichon of Heshbon refused to let us pass through because the Lord had stiffened his will, hardened his heart, in order to deliver him into your power, as is now the case. And the Lord said to me, see, I begin by placing Sichon and his land at your disposal. Begin the occupation, take possession of his land. So then we read, Sichon with all his men took the field against us at Yachtzah. Then the Lord our God delivered him to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all his men. At that time we captured all his towns, and we doomed every town, men, women, and children, leaving no survivor. We retained as booty only the cattle and the spoil of the cities that we captured. So then we move on. And here's the imagining that you read just this story, which is pretty much the same that we read in the book of Numbers, this incredible victory of the Israelites. But I'm imagining that one man says, you forgot something. Moses leaves out one important detail in his telling of our great victory over Sichon and the Amorites. Israelite casualties. There is no mention of our dead and wounded. Our leader was not present when the flag-draped coffins arrived from the battlefield, and film crews were not allowed to cover the funerals on television. So as I've often done, I either try to bring the 20th, 21st century back into the Bible days, or bring Bible days up to contemporary times. And as we all remember, whether it was the war in Vietnam or whether it was the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, that there was a time when casualties were mounting and it wasn't considered politically a good thing. to show coffins coming into Dover, Delaware, every day, every other day. And so, in a sense, the government told the news crews, you can't go there. You can't do that. So we have to imagine, even if there was this massive victory of the Israelites and they wiped out the enemy completely, it doesn't seem reasonable or possible that the Israelites didn't have casualties, right? So here's what happened. Was Moses worried about the morale of the people? That if they knew how many of our soldiers died or were wounded, they'd lose the stomach to continue fighting. But look around. See all those men on crutches without a leg? Have you heard about those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder? Some of whom go on to kill themselves or others, all of whom wake up screaming in the middle of the night, remembering the slaughter of women and children. As complete a victory as it was, it came at a significant cost. Okay, and that's something that we forget, and you don't read about any of those details. Probably the point of the Torah in telling us the story, look at the great victory that God gave, and they skip over the details. How many of our boys were wounded or were killed? But given who we are and what we've all lived through and what we know about, it's hard to read this story without thinking about that aspect, okay? And then this same man says, don't misunderstand me. This was a war we tried to avoid, and the enemy wouldn't let us. And that's true. In the book of Numbers, the people went to Sichon and said, we're going to go straight through. We're not going to touch any food or water. We're going to go as fast as we can. Just give us safe passage, and we'll get out of here quickly. And Sichon said, no way, and attacked them. And it was then that the Israelites fought back and won this great victory. We asked to pass peaceably through his territory. We offered him a truce. He attacked us. We had no alternative but to fight. But why pretend that this was an immaculate victory? We're left with the impression that this was a campaign without cost in blood or treasure. I assure you it was not. My son died in the war with Sichon. And again, that's an aspect of the Bible stories that we never consider, we never hear about, but it had to have been true. There can be no war when one side is completely destroyed and the other has no casualties at all. That's, it'd be one thing if you're talking about, okay, if you send over bombers and you bomb their cities and none of our planes were shot down. But war in the Torah was hand-to-hand combat. It doesn't make sense that it could have happened without Israelites suffering. So this piece simply says we need to remember that. And in remembering that about the Torah, it also is a way for us to acknowledge what happens in our own world today, about the price that people pay who fight a war, and whether it's PTSD or, all of those things that are part of the horrible thing that war can do to people. So we come now to chapter 3, and on page 996, we read the following. So the Lord our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan, And we dealt them such a blow that no survivor was left. We captured all his towns, 60 of them. And all these towns were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars. We doomed them as we had done in the case of King Sihon. And then it says, thus we seized at that time from the two Amorite kings the country beyond the Jordan. So the war took place probably in what today would be considered the kingdom of Jordan, to the west and south of, to the east and south of where Jerusalem would be. And then we're told the following: only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining kings. And then a fascinating footnote. His bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. So in other words, after Og and his people, his tribe, were defeated, the Ammonites, not to be confused with the Amorites, the Ammonites, by the way, Ammonites, probably a hint towards the capital of Jordan, Amman. Ammonites, that's probably where the name came from. It was one of the local tribes at the time. So the Ammonites came in and they probably pillaged and looted whatever was left of Bashan and Og, their king. His bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit. So what is a cubit? Remember, back in Bible times, they didn't measure by either the foot or the meter. They measured by a cubit. A cubit went from the elbow to the tip of the finger. So it's approximately 18 inches. There were other measurements like a tefach, a fist, which went from here to here, which is approximately 4 inches, right? So there were all these different ways of conveniently measuring before they had rulers and other such things. And here we're told that King Og of Bashan, his bed, which was made of iron, my guess is that most people, if they didn't sleep on the floor with a blanket or maybe some kind of cushion, they probably had a wooden bedstead, a wooden frame, and there were ropes that tied from one side of the wooden frame to the other. And then a blanket or a cushion was put on top of that. That's what people slept on. But this is the king, and so his bedstead was made out of iron. And we're told that it was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. So 9 times a foot and a half means that his bed was approximately 13 and a half feet long. Now, why would you have a bed that's 13 and a half feet long? Unless the person was a giant. And so based on that, the rabbis later tell stories about how Og was indeed a giant, whether he was 12 foot tall or merely 7 foot tall, hard to know. But of course, there are stories all about giants, Goliath being the most famous giant of them all. And if you remember back in the book of Numbers, we have the story that when the Israelites go to spy out the land, they bring back this huge cluster of grapes, And they tell the people, this is an incredibly fruitful land, but the people who live there are giants. Look at the grapes that they have. So this all follows from the idea that there are people in life who are giants. We call them basketball players, or if you go to Coney Island, you may see, the world's tallest man, things like that. So we're aware that there are people like this. So here's what I'm imagining. Moses says the following: 40 years ago, it took 2 of our men to carry 1 cluster of grapes from the land promised to the Israelites. The size of the fruit hinted not only about the richness of the land, but about the giants who lived there. 10 of the spies and most of the Israelites despaired of ever conquering such giants and such a land. And because of that despair, we were forced to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And here we are, Moses says, 40 years later, on the verge of entering that land. And it is taking 8 men to carry off the bed frame of one of those very giants that we once feared, Og, king of Bashan, who we have just defeated in battle. Okay, so trying to tie together the legends, the bed, what does it mean, and the previous story. It's a very rabbinic idea to connect stories that don't seem to be connected. The idea of this bed frame that was 13 feet long, with the idea of there must have been giants in the land that was reported by the spies. So we bring those 2 things together, and Moses says it's true, but we don't have to worry because God will be with us and behind us. Okay, so now we come to the Haftorah, and we have a special Haftorah this week. The Haftorah for Deuteronomy is found in the Chumash on page 1000. It's the 3rd of the 3 Haftorahs of warning, of Puranuta, of punishment that will come upon the people unless they change their ways. You may remember that the 3 Haftorahs were recited on the 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz, when the Babylonians had laid siege to Jerusalem and then broke through on the 17th of Tammuz through the gates of the city. And then it took them 3 weeks to reach the Temple Mount, to destroy the opposition, and ultimately to burn down the temple and to destroy it. So in the 3 weeks prior to Tisha B'Av, which comes a week from tomorrow, actually a week from tonight, right? We will have our services. So we have the idea of the 3 weeks of warning prior to Tisha B'Av. Because the people didn't listen to the prophets and their warnings, the terrible punishment came about. So that's part of the story that we have. The message of Jeremiah in the past 2 weeks, the message of Isaiah this week is you better change or else. Okay. By the way, this week's Haftorah has a special name, and the whole Shabbos has a name. It's called Shabbat Chazon, the Shabbat of the vision, because the Haftorah begins with the word Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah, the vision of what would happen to the people if they didn't change their ways. So here's what I'm imagining. One of the great moments, great meaning important moments of history of Western civilization takes place in the year 1517 in the town of Wittenberg, Germany. And if you recall, that's when a Catholic priest, Martin Luther, goes to the church and he nails to the door of the church a document called the 95 Theses. And basically what had upset Martin Luther was the notion, the Catholic idea, that if you had committed a sin, well, when you die, you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to be sent to purgatory before heaven, or if you're really bad, before being sent to hell. You're going to be sent to purgatory where you will be punished. However, there's a way out. If you make a donation to the church, we can write these things off. That instead of suffering in purgatory, you give a donation to the church and you're good. Well, Martin Luther was deeply offended by this concept, what was called in the church indulgences. And at that point, he makes this epic changing act, nailing a document to the door, 95 reasons why this is a wrong, immoral, terrible thing for the church to do. And of course, it was because of that moment, this led to the Reformation, this led to the split in the Western world between Catholicism and Protestantism. And Martin Luther becomes really the father of the Protestant movement, of Lutheranism. And it was all based on this moment of very dramatically nailing to the church door this statement about why what the priests are doing is wrong. Okay, so here's what I'm imagining. All these years before, if we're talking about Isaiah the prophet, first Isaiah lived around the year 750 BCE. So we're talking about 2,200 years before Martin Luther. And although Isaiah didn't do the same thing that Luther did from a dramatic point of view, his intent was really the same. It was to say that what's happening is unacceptable. God is not happy about it. It's wrong. It needs to stop. That's the message of Isaiah to the Jewish people around the year 750 BCE. So here's what I'm imagining, that Isaiah goes to the temple in Jerusalem and he nails to the door of the temple the following statement. In essence, it's the main words of the Haftorah. So we're going to hear Isaiah say the following. Hear the word of the Lord, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to our God's instruction, you folk of Gomorrah. Right? And the idea is that he's calling the Jews the equivalent of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he puts into God's mouth the following words. Why are you people coming to the temple? Why are you offering sacrifices? God says to them, I hate this. I'm not going to accept your sacrifices, and you're doing a terrible thing. So what does God want if not sacrifices? And here we're going to see in verse 16, page 1002, wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wrong. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. Right? And he says, he had said previously, I'm sick and tired of you bringing these sacrifices. What do I need them for? He said, who asked you to come? Why do you trample my courts? Don't come back here bringing me all these animals and the grain offerings and the wine. It doesn't work. Incense is offensive to me. I can't stand what you're doing. Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They are becoming a burden to me. I cannot endure them. And God says, when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. When you pray, I'm not even going to listen anymore. Can you imagine, when the rabbi's sermon is basically, why are you people here? God is not interested in anything you have to say. He's not interested in your coming. He's not interested in your prayers. He's not going to listen. He's not going to answer them. He doesn't want you here anymore. Right? This would be startling for the people to hear such a message from the rabbi. Well, this was the message that the prophet brought to the temple. And although he may not have nailed the document, the parchment, to the temple door, you get the idea. He did it in a speech. So here's what I'm imagining. Isaiah comes and puts up a sign on the temple door that says, until further notice, the temple is closed. Can you imagine people showing up for either pilgrimage festivals and they've got their animals and, it says temple is closed. Forget about it. Can't come in. And God says the following, I've had it with your offerings. I'm disgusted by all your rams and bulls, lambs and goats. I don't want them. People originally thought you make a mistake, you give God a gift. God says, oh, that was very generous, very kind. Pagans before the Jews would have said, we need something to eat. When you kill the animal and you burn it and the smell, the odor, the fragrance goes up to heaven, the gods are, in a sense, eating through that fragrant smoke. And because you fed the gods will now repay you by answering your prayers, giving you what you've asked for. So the Jews borrowed that idea of offering a sacrifice, although they eliminated the idea of, no, it's not about feeding God. But they did begin to think, we do a sin, we bring a sacrifice, we're good. Hey, is that any different from people who come on Yom Kippur who say, I put myself through the torture of sitting here and listening for hours and hours, right? Or I fast for a whole day, and so I'm good. If I've been willing to suffer in that way, God is certainly going to forgive me. And the message of the prophets and later the message of the rabbis is, no, it doesn't work that way. It's not magic. If you do A, then B happens. That's magic. Jews don't believe in magic. What we believe in is that the ritual is to sort of awaken within you feelings of of grief, of sorrow, of regret, right? And because of that, you're going to change your ways. And indeed, that's what the Haftorah of Isaiah on Yom Kippur really is about. You know, the people say, we fasted and we didn't get what we wanted. And God, through the prophet, says to the people, is this the fast that I have asked of you? No, it's not magic. I ask you to fast because then you'll feel what hungry people are going through. And once you really understand it, you'll do something about it. You'll feed the hungry. And that's what God wants. And that's what's going to change God's mind about what the decree will be for his people. Right? So he says, your holiday celebrations make me sick. We're always saying how many people were in shul, we're doing well. The more people that come, the more successful that we are. And God is saying the opposite. I don't want you people here. At least I don't want you here if you're not going to change how you behave and how you act. Your incense is offensive. Remember that in the temple, you were bringing all thousands and thousands of animals. Animals stink. And then when you kill them and cut out their intestines, the stink is even worse. And so therefore, it's like a slaughterhouse. And in order to overcome that, part of the ritual was burning incense. There were two altars. The large altar was for slaughter of animals. The smaller altar was for taking incense and burning it, which wafted throughout the temple area a very pleasant fragrance. And it overcame the horror of the smell of dead animal guts. Your sacrifices are worthless. Don't trample my courts anymore. In other words, I don't want you here. Don't come back. When you lift your hands, people used to pray like this. And so God is basically saying, don't even bother. No matter how long you pray, I will not listen. Here's what I want from you. Do good, right? And these verses are important. In verse 17, we read the following. Limdu hetev, learn to do good. Hetev from the word tov. Dirshu mishpat, search out, seek justice, right? Chase after it, seek after it. It's an active thing on your part, not passive. Ashru chamotz, aid the wrong when they're the wronged. When there are people who are being taken advantage of, you have to step in and become their champions. Shiftu yatom, specifically, find justice for the orphan. The orphan doesn't have a father who can look out for him, who can help him. And so therefore, you have to take on the orphan. And rivu almana, defend the cause of the widow. Who's going to stick up for the orphan and the widow, if not a father or a husband who don't exist? The answer is you. Even though they're not your family, that's the people that God wants you to take care of. The people who are without a champion. You have to become their champion. And so he says, only then, when you do that, only then will Zion be saved. And so the very last line of the Haftorah says, Zion, Mount Zion, one of the hills of Jerusalem, but Zion becomes a synonym for Jerusalem, which is really a synonym for the land of Israel. Zion b'mishpat tipadeh. Zion will be saved, right, in the judgment. V'shaveha b'tzedakah, her repentant ones in the retribution. You think that the enemy is, I warned you, you do wrong, the enemy is going to come down. And the enemy at this time were the Assyrians, who in the year 722 came down and destroyed the northern kingdom and took away the 10 tribes, 10 lost tribes. And how are we going to be saved? Well, maybe people thought, we're talking about military power. If we make an alliance with Egypt and then we go in with Egypt and then we'll fight the enemy from the north, God and the prophet is saying, it doesn't work that way. That God uses, moves the Assyrians, later the Babylonians, later the Greeks, later the Romans. He uses them like chess pieces to accomplish his mission. And his mission is to punish the people for what they have done wrong. And you want to be saved, it's not by military might, it's by doing justice. If God is happy, God will make sure that the enemy does not harm you. So that's our story for today. And we'll pick up Mariv in about 15 minutes or so.